Basically, my name is Mo Hassan. I'm from Buffalo, New York, and educationally, I have a BS in chemical engineering back in 1985, and then I have an MBA in marketing in 1996, both degrees from the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York. And I started my career with the Procter & Gamble Company. And most recently, I was the vice president of M&T Bank in Buffalo, New York. And at the same time, I was married to Aasiya from the year 2000 to 2009, so about a 9-year marriage. And, it was a heterodox case where it was a case of a male being a victim of domestic violence by his wife. And my abuse victimization ended in 2009, unfortunately, with the third homicide of Aasiya. And I'm truly very sorry for that. I do not condone violence. And this tragedy also led me to understanding what happened, why all this transpired. And essentially, I came to realize that there are two competing theories of domestic violence as to what causes domestic violence. One is the adverse childhood experiences, and the other is the gender-based is science, and the latter is essentially bigotry. And we have a law in our nation known as the Violence Against Women Act, which is built on the foundation of gender-based violence theory. Now, since domestic violence affects 1 in 3 men and women in their lifetimes, this scientific and unjust policy can also harm your family and your household. So it's important to understand what's going on in terms of policy and how it affected my personal life. One, after the homicide, female medical doctors diagnosed me with the trauma of battered spouse syndrome, which is evidence of self-defense to a spousal homicide. Thousands of women have been acquitted of a murder charge by presenting DBS as evidence. But this rule of law has never been applied on behalf of a man in an exorcide case. The word exorcide means the killing of a wife by her husband. So my jury was not allowed to hear from my doctors or scientists or see any of the 2,000 plus emails between me and my wife. Now, as I mentioned, this forced me into kind of digging in, trying to understand. So what happens is with this gender-based violence movement started back in the 1970s. Back then, husbands and wives were killing each other at an equal rate of about 1,200 each per year. Then the shelter abusive marriages. This caused the intimate partner homicides of husbands, not wives, but the homicides of husbands to decline by 75%. So why did this happen? Basically, because battered women no longer had to kill their male abusers to escape from the interminable torture of domestic violence. Now, the bigoted Violence Against Women Act does not recognize or help battered men who feel trapped. So some escape this entrapment by killing their female abusers, just like battered women used to do. So thus, despite squandering $50 billion since 1994, the Violence Against Women Act is generating 30,000 incremental homicides of wives over husbands. And Andrew, I've mailed you a copy of this graph, which shows the homicide rate for both genders. So now, this gender-based violence theory not only undergirds the Violence Against Women Act, but it's become a universal global issue. And according to the United Nations, globally more than 50,000 women are being killed each year by their intimate partners or family members. And under the gender-based violence theory, this number has doubled since 2002. So now to help you understand how adverse childhood experiences cause adult domestic violence, let me share with you a story from the memoir of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She describes she grew up in a home rife with domestic violence by both of her parents. She writes, "My parents did nothing but fight." She describes describes that the biggest fight her parents ever had was when her mother got home from work one day and there was no milk for her coffee. And then Justice Sotomayor gives us some insights into why her mother became an adult abuser. Is that when her mother was born in 1927 in Puerto Rico, her father abandoned her family. Her own mother was an invalid, so discipline fell into the hands of her much older brother, Mayo, who would frequently beat his little sister. So Justice Sotomayor's mother grew up with the twin traumas of abandonment and abuse. The medical community refers to these traumas as adverse childhood experiences, which then unconsciously produce adult domestic violence. And in my own case, in the email of December 3, 2006, I'm describing to Aasiya's brother, Aasiya being my wife, her brother, that even when I remove myself from her violence to go live in the basement, she comes downstairs to beat me up. And how this domestic violence happens every week. Now, in an email from our courtship days from the year 2000, Aasiya is describing to me how she grew up witnessing a lot of domestic violence between her parents, and how, as a little girl, these episodes were used to scare the hell out of her. Scientists refer to this trauma as exposure to domestic violence between parents. It is also a part of the adverse childhood experiences that produce adult spouse abusers. But please note that 70% of the children who experience adverse childhood experiences never become adult abusers. But all domestic abusers are victims of adverse childhood experiences, and these adverse childhood experiences can produce at least 3 invisible psychological injuries in a person. One is internalized shame, which tells the person of the law, I'm defective, I'm a mistake, there's something wrong with me, I'm not preparable. In essence, internalized shame produces self-rejection in a person. 2, insecure attachments. These people develop so much anxiety and fear that it becomes difficult for them to form a secure attachment bond with a romantic partner. 3, they can develop personality disorders. The 2 most prevalent disorders among abusers are antisocial and borderline personality disorder. And my wife was suffering with a borderline issue. Collectively, Dr. Leonard Shengold, MD, refers to these 3 psychological injuries as the soul murder of the child. So essentially, as an adult, the abuser is unconsciously trying to steal the soul of his or her victimized spouse through a deadly addiction to control. Psychological testing accurately tells us which spouse is the abuser. Now, there are 3 sex stereotypes that may make it difficult for you to understand men as victims of domestic violence. 1, men are physically bigger and stronger than women. But domestic violence is unconsciously motivated by a psychological illness where size is irrelevant. Besides, abusive wives neutralize the size disparity by using physical objects and biased sports as weapons. Violent wives often attack with baseball bats, fireplace pokers, screwdrivers, scissors, knives, and more as weapons. Since our gender are based solely on gender, not any psychological testing, female abusers sham as battered women to make false accusations of domestic violence against their battered husbands. Research finds that up to 80% are false. Thus, the shield of restraining orders is being used mostly as a sword by female abusers, report Dr. Kathy Young. 2, since 90% of street crimes are committed by men, the stereotype, in fact, Dr. Marian Aaron Saft, MD, reports that domestic violence is the only form of violence perpetration where women outnumber men. Now, in street crimes, mostly criminal offenders kill innocent victims. In domestic violence, mostly abused victims kill their abusers. Now, 3, due to the chivalry norm, abused men do not hit a woman back. Therefore, female abusers batter their male partners with impunity. Now, there's a very important distinction that scientists make in domestic violence. Scientists bifurcate domestic violence into 2 categories: common couple violence versus intimate terrorism. Common couple violence is minor, mutual, momentary. It dissipates without any external intervention. common couple violence is motivated by family conflict or stress and poor communication skills, not by a desire to control the house. More than 90% of the domestic violence is common couple violence. Couples counseling eliminates this problem. Less than 10% of the domestic violence is intimate terrorism, which involves a deadly addiction to control one's spouse. This requires individual therapy to heal an abuser's childhood trauma. Tragically, a foolish Violence Against Women Act prohibits couples counseling and the medical treatment of abusers. Now, the important thing here is to understand that adverse childhood experiences affect boys and girls equally. So, that's why nearly 2,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies find that at least half of all domestic abusers are women. Scientists have summarized these studies online at the website www.domesticviolenceresearch.org. 70% of these studies have been published by women with records. But the gender-based violence grandees use intimidation and abuse to muzzle scientists and journalists, and this is why the broader public have no awareness that an overwhelming corpus of science finds gender equality in domestic violence. This allows, at this point in time, I also want to make a small distinction that Dr. Christina Hoff Summer reports that there are two kinds of feminists. One is the equity feminists. These are the good feminists who believe in gender equality for both men and women. The other is misandry feminism. These feminists basically demonize men as source of all evil, and they do so to gain power and control for themselves over the government institutions. So they basically intimidate and abuse scientists and journalists and politicians into suppressing this overwhelming corpus of science. So basically they're forcing the Department of Justice to cover up not only the scientific data, but also the data that the Violence Against Women Act is not saving any lives of women, but instead it's producing 30,000 incremental homicides of wives of her husband. Now, let's understand, let me explain the gender-based violence theory to you. Essentially, the gender-based violence theory claims that all domestic violence is caused by misogyny, gender inequality, toxic masculinity, and social power imbalances between the sexes in patriarchal cultures. That is, men use domestic violence to subordinate and oppress women. Now, under this foolish ideology, men can never be the victims of domestic violence by women. Interestingly, there is not a single scientific study in the world that supports this feminist fiction that only men abuse women. Yet, this theory of dogma is being preached to judges, prosecutors, police, non-stop. Now, let us look at the foolishness of the gender-based violence dogma. Scientific studies find a much higher rate of domestic violence among lesbian couples than heterosexual couples. So, where is misogyny and gender inequality in domestic violence among lesbian couples? But all scientific studies find that at least half of all domestic abusers are women, then where is patriarchy in domestic violence? The notion that misogyny or gender inequality causes domestic violence is as absurd as to claim that these factors cause breast cancer. So how do the misandry feminists manipulate women? You see, all of their so-called studies survey only women, not men. Women are asked only about their domestic violence victimization, not perpetration. These fraudulent studies are then presented to women by a colonized Department of Justice and appliant press. Look, just because someone is an advocate for cancer patients, it does not make them qualified to diagnose and treat cancer. Similarly, the illness of domestic violence needs to be diagnosed and treated by medical professionals, not bigoted domestic violence advocates. Do you honestly believe that a restraining order can stop an alcoholic from drinking? These advocates are so foolish that they think restraining orders can stop the addiction of domestic violence. Since the domestic violence advocates do not know how to treat the illness and abusiveness, the only solution is to destroy the family with mandatory arrest, restraining orders, no-drop prosecution, incarceration, and divorce. 90% of the abuse victims have rejected these family-destroying options as they don't even report their abuse to the police. Now, the most important point here is to understand that the Violence Against Women Act is a bipartisan blunder. Let me explain. In 1990, then U.S. Senator Joe Biden, a Democrat from Delaware, and U.S. Senator Orrin Hatch, a Republican from Utah, started holding hearings on domestic violence in the U.S. Congress. They committed 4 fatal errors. 1, they did not allow any scientists to testify. Thus, they failed to discover that half of all domestic abusers are women. 2, they did not allow any doctors to testify. Thus, they failed to discover that adverse childhood experiences, not gender, motivates domestic violence. 3, they did not allow abused men to testify. Thus, they failed to understand how women better men. 4, they never cross-examined the domestic violence advocates with the corpus of science. This is the type of wonder that's generating 30,000 dead lives. Now, this begs the question, why do intelligent lawmakers make foolish laws? The answer comes to us from John Stuart Mill, a 19th century savant. Mill tells us that when bigotry becomes the ideology of the majority, the lawmakers re-victimize the oppressed minority in order to get themselves elected. Think Jim Crow. Mill refers to this blind spot of democracy as the tyranny of the majority. During this mob rule, the Department of Justice becomes a marionette of bigots. Recall the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Department of Justice was so foolish that it honestly believed that the true victims were the slave owners who kept losing their recalcitrant property. The police, prosecutors, and judges worked with alacrity to arrest the repatriate of the runaway slaves. Today, a colonized Department of Justice censors 2,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies and the genocide data to falsely tell us that only men abuse women. So, now, the interesting part is that abuse victims have already rejected the Violence Against Women Act. How do we know this? Because 90% of the battered women do not even report their abuse victimization to the police, and those who report, 90% of them recant. Why? Because abuse victims want their partners treated, not punished. They want their families kept intact, not destroyed. Now, Chris Anderson, he's the CEO of TED Talks. Most of you have heard of TED, the deepest force behind moral progress. I disagree. There's a force that is even more powerful than reason. What? The answer comes to us by Voltaire, who tells us reason is no match for fear. Or she obediently sweeps science under the rug. The American people deserve the scientific truth from the U.S. Attorney General, not the censorship of science for political reasons. Look, we cannot bring my wife back, but you can stop the killing of a day for 40 years by asking the U.S. Attorney General to take the following 4 actions. 1, publicly recognize and help battered men and female abusers. 2, protect scientists and journalists from Americans so they can finally start reporting the scientific truth. 3, stop funding the gender-based violence hate. Use these funds to retrain the court violence to adverse childhood experiences. 4, provide medical treatment to abusers to heal their childhood trauma. This is the only way to stop the generational cycle of domestic violence. So this is the core issue as to why abused men are not being recognized, they're not being believed by the courts. But when you go to the courts, they're simply re-victimized and not believed. What I would like to do a little bit is to give your audience a perspective on my own personal victimization. That my life was so quick to raging with violence that I found it easier and safer to communicate with help from a distance using emails and text messages. So more than 2,000 emails are still sitting with our servers. And when she print them out, there are 4 messages in the email. So people can get a direct picture as to how the abuse is happening in real time. So I'll give you a few examples from these emails. On August 28, 2006, I'm writing an email to Aasiya that last night you threw my medicine across the room. If something was bothering you, you could have simply asked politely. You destroy love and goodwill with your abusive behaviors. So her reply comes half an hour later. It either is complete denial and coercive control through lawyers, because abusive women know that in the legal system, any woman is accepted as a battered woman and any man is viewed as the abuser. So the legal system, the police, prosecutors, and judges are being used as a coercive control weapon to abuse men. Now, around this time, I discovered my own abuse validation because I picked up a book on domestic violence by an author named Patricia Evans. So after reading her book, I wrote her an email on August 28, 2006 at 8:28 p.m. I wrote to her, and the email read, I'm a male suffering in an abusive relationship with an extremely controlling and dominating wife. It's really hurting me. We have 2 children, and I cannot afford to walk out on my family. Can you please kindly help? A day later, Patricia Evans replied to me in an email. She writes, please give me a call. This is my number. It can be quite a serious thing when a woman is abusive. Now, at the time, I did not fully understand how serious it was. At this point, I believe the reason it is so serious is nobody believes in the existence of female abusers in the legal system. So there's no help or accountability in a couple which is suffering from a female perpetrated domestic violence. Now, there was another email that I exchanged with Dr. Patricia Evans where I wrote to her on August 31st, 2006. Her abuse is very hurtful and dehumanizing to me. She constantly interrupts, engages in name-calling, makes false accusations, erupts in rages, and negates my hurt and feelings. She makes never-ending demands accompanied by threats. So either do this or she's going to the police or taking the children away or whatnot. So Patricia Evans replied to me the following day saying, asking someone to stop abusive behaviors will not do much. In other words, she did not even be aware of when she does it or why. She may feel that what she says is nothing compared to what she thinks has been done to her, even if you have done nothing. And then she bolded and underlined, even if you've done nothing. This allows her to discount your hurt, deny her abuse, and maintain control over you. Now, for me, this reply was a bit of a shocker because when she said she did not have any awareness, so I could not understand how could she not be aware of what she's doing. But later on, as I came to learn and study the borderline personality disorder, it helped me understand that abusers honestly are engaged in abusive behavior out of an illness, not by choice. And by abuser, I mean people involved in intimate terrorism, not common couple violence. Common couple violence is a nothing burger that kind of goes away on its own. It's the intimate terrorism that ends up resulting in intimate partner homicide. Now, in another email on September 11, 2006, I'm writing to her, physical abuse is a weekly and daily recurrence. You have repeatedly abused me with name-calling, threats, blame, false accusation, and shouting on a weekly, if not daily basis. Hence, I sleep in the dirty basement. At least it is safe. So she replies to my email about there's a 1-week gap. She writes to me. So this is Aasiya writing to me on September 20th, 2006. My dearest king, I know one bottom line now. I love you. It is as clear as it goes. I I know I have betrayed your trust and love. I'm working on my bad language and abusive communication. This has already started in the list format. This will help me consciously not to use the same abusive lingo. I'm in love with you and you alone. When you're hurting, I'm not happy either. So at the time, I fully accepted it at face value. But over time, you come to realize this is a cycle where these false promises to change and apologies come after each type of abusive behavior. So there's another email from December 3, 2006. In this email, I'm reaching out to Aasiya's brother, whose name is Haris. In this email, I'm writing to Haris about Aasiya, that if I'm not in agreement and have a difference of opinion, then I'm the worst possible human being that has ever walked on this earth. I get interrupted and not allowed to speak my opinion. I get yelled at and shouted upon and called all sorts of demeaning names. To seek peace, I simply moved down to the basement. Yesterday, she came to the basement and started hitting me repeatedly and physically beating me with slaps on the face, punches, scratches, pushes. Then she threatens divorce to take the kids away. And this is how it happens every week. So later on, I would come to understand some of the things that abusers do not tolerate a difference of opinion. And the reason behind that is a person who's suffering from a borderline personality disorder, psychologically, their self-identity resides inside their spouse. So when the spouse has a difference of opinion, suddenly the spouse becomes a different person, and that becomes psychologically a threat to their own self-identity. So they react quite violently if you have a difference of opinion. So again, those are...
Okay, Mo, so can you talk a little bit about your crime before we take questions and comments? Like, can you just talk about everything that went down and we can go from there?
Yeah, so basically I have been living in this state for 8 years, and over time it started to become more and more frequent. So it was constant physical violence, threat, breaking of things, laptops, mic glasses, money, threatened to go to the police, go get a restraining order, and whatnot. And one of the really sad parts of our system is that judges grant restraining orders without hearing both sides of the story. So essentially, they're giving loaded guns to the person. So I was living in that state, and when I was diagnosed with the battered spouse syndrome, the female doctors who diagnosed me, they usually inform me. Usually, what they do is they talk to the battered woman after the homicide to understand their story and look for key symptoms. The battered spouse syndrome has about 24 different symptoms. But in my case, even before they came to interview me, that we're going through all the email traffic between me and my wife, and their assessment was that they've never seen a more solid and more documented case of battered spouse syndrome, because all the different symptoms are documented in emails multiple times. And at the time, I had no idea what battered spouse syndrome is. I was just talking about my own mental state. So there are a couple of emails that may also give you some insights as to what was going on just a few days before the homicide. So I had one day, Aasiya came after me with an upturned knife, and I ran away, and she chased after me. And right after that incident, I wrote to my father in an email saying, Aasiya just informed me that she's so angry that she wants to murder me in my sleep. I'm informing you so that you are aware of any unforeseen things happens to me. Now, what was the reason behind her becoming so angry? Because by this time, and this is just a few days before the homicide, is I have reached out to her family. constantly exchanging long emails with her family, giving them full details about her abusive behavior. They're confronting her with those abusive behaviors, and she's getting mad and angry, and she wants me to basically stop talking to her brother. A lot of you may have heard the thing called fear of exposure, that when abuser gets exposed, they retaliate. So one of her retaliation weapon was that after I ran away from the knife, is she sent me an email. In this email, she writes, "I perceive your emails to my family as harassment. If you do not stop, I'll get an order of protection against you." So again, these orders of protection were used as a sword, not as a shield. And this is the last email. This is the email just before the homicide, just a few hours before, the day before the homicide, in which I'm telling her, when you negotiate with the weapon of restraining order, sword, it makes me feel that a gun was put to my head to steal my basic rights. I felt exploited. I felt trapped. I felt helpless. It made me feel unsafe. I felt like a prisoner. I felt like a hostage at the mercy of a terrorist. And again, this was one of the events that the doctors flagged, that the abused victims feel like he's in a prison. He feels trapped with no way out. He feels like he's being held hostage by a terrorist. So this becomes the mental state where you feel like there's absolutely no way out. So you end up, you feel like the level of force and control is so strong with the battered spouse syndrome trauma that the victim feels that the only way out is by killing their abuser. So that becomes their subjective belief system. And that's what the battered spouse syndrome is. And tragically, these tragedies are happening in the United States 3 to 4 times a day, every single day for the last 40 years. Because there's no recognition that men are being victimized and women can also be abusers. So that mental state led me to the point where I felt the only way out was the homicide.
Hey Mo, six days before this took place, she filed for divorce, correct?
Correct.
So were you guys living in separate houses, or were you in the same house at the time when she filed for divorce? Was she already gone?
Okay, so that is basically this continuation of the thing where I'm exposing her abusive behavior to her family. Now, family are the people who are not going to hurt her. My intention is to get her family support so we can get her into treatment. So she refuses treatment, all of them do. And so her weapon of choice is to go to the court and get a restraining order, file for these things to get me to stop exposing her abuse. Now, look at how our judicial system works. Without ever talking to me or hearing my side of the story, they issued her the restraining order. So, again, this goes down to the gender-based violence ideology that they already know which gender is doing the abuse, so they don't need to hear both sides of the story. In the same way, this law was enacted without hearing from the scientific community, just based on one-sided information. So that also makes you feel even more trapped. And this is basically a continuation of abuse, because now you're not only being abused by the wife, you're also being abused by the entire judicial system, in which, police, prosecutors, judges, they all believe one side. And then, even when I went to my trial, and I have all these documented emails, the judge went through elaborate mechanism of twisting and turning the rules of evidence to not allow the jury to see this evidence. But it's also unfair to blame the judges, because this suppression of evidence and science is starting at the Department of Justice. Why? Because in every court, they have planted the domestic violence advocates who serve on top of the judge. Likewise, in the Department of Justice, they have created an office on violence against women And the poor U.S. Attorney General works for this Office of Violence Against Women. And the purpose of this Office of Violence Against Women is to suppress all scientific studies and to suppress all evidence of domestic violence by women. So it's a completely one-sided system. So when you mentioned that she filed for divorce, it's being used as a sword, not as a shield.
But so what you're trying to say is you don't think she wanted a divorce. You think what she was just filing for divorce to spite you or whatever. I mean, were you guys living in the same household when the abuse was going on after she filed for divorce? Like you said that this was like what were you being abused at the time the actual homicide took place, or was this like to stop the abuse? What would you say the motive was, I guess?
Like, her motive was that by this time, this is January 2009, and the homicide happened February 12th. By this time, I could no longer take the abuse, and I was basically reporting her abuse to family members to get her into treatment. Okay, so she continuously threatened me to stop exchanging emails with her family, and if I don't, that she's going to get a restraining order, and then eventually she did get a restraining order and file for divorce and all that, to basically take the kids away from me, to punish me, get me stopped exposing her abuse. And even when I went to my criminal trial and I tried to explain all this abuse, it gets censored by the courts, by the media. My case, not alone, Andrew. I mean, look at the fact, in 10 million domestic violence cases, no judge in America has ever placed a woman in a batterer program. Zero. Right? No court in America has heard the battered spouse give evidence on behalf of a man. The experts are not allowed. My divorce is being used as a sword. Now, on the very day after the restraining order, I moved into a hotel. Now, but there was a caveat in the restraining order that we worked at the same company. I was the CEO and she worked at Pages TV. So during the daytime, we were at work together. So on this last day of work, there was a person named Dr. Yasmin Khan, who was a personal friend. She was also a shareholder in my company, and she was also helping me handle the abuse. And I was extremely jealous of her. So this last day, she was threatening me with a knife that I need to stop all communication with Yasmin Khan. And because, she can't tolerate that, and I kept trying to tell her that, look, I mean, she's a shareholder, she's a friend, she's not trying to hurt you, she's not trying to hurt anyone, and she's accusing me of having, an affair or relationship with her. There's none of that, but that's what abusers have, is they have an extreme, profound amount of jealousy, which goes back to the soul murder thing that I was trying to tell you, that there's an inner emptiness, and they get extremely jealous. So there was a threat with the knife she put into my neck, and living under these conditions, so there's a physical knife, and then there's the sword of the whole criminal justice system, which is falling on me. And there's precedence to that because a year earlier, she had done the restraining order. We went to court. A medical doctor evaluated our whole family. He testified in court that my wife is the abusive spouse in the marriage and she needs treatment. Yet the judge did not end her the treatment at all. The next day I learned that in this criminal justice system, there's no recognition of women as abusers, and there's no help for them. There's no help for male victims. So essentially, it's a continuation of abuse, and that's not just my opinion. This is what several scientific papers, the website that I gave you, domesticviolenceresearch.org, scientists find the same thing, is that the judicial system is used as an additional weapon, and it's a continuation of abuse because battered men are not believed and they're simply re-victimized. And this is the same thing happened in my trial because you're not allowed to present any evidence. You're not allowed to call your doctors. You're not allowed to call your scientists. And it's a circus. I mean, it's a total and complete circus. And this is exactly how the violence against women act was legislated.
All right, so Mo, we don't have a whole lot of time left. So I just want to ask you one more question before we move on to take questions. Okay, so at the time this homicide took place, was she abusing you at that moment in time, or was she almost like lured down there for you to, I guess you would say, stop the abuse permanently?
The physical, that night threat happened, I think, between 2 and 3 p.m. in the office. Then she left, I left, and we were going to meet again at the office around 6 p.m.-ish. So by that time, that's when the homicide happened, when we met again. And so there's basically a 3 to 4 hour gap between the last abuse and the actual homicide. And the case law explains that in battered spouse syndrome, there's always a gap of a few hours because there are 3 cycles of abuse. So the homicide seldom happens in the middle of the abuse. That is more of what happens in street violence cases. So like a street violence case, somebody's attacking you, you attack back. But in domestic violence cases, homicides usually happen in a lull between the episodes.
Okay, so somebody had asked if you were being abused, why didn't you just leave the abusive situation?
Right. It's a very common question that gets asked quite frequently. So let me give you some reasons. This is from the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence as to why battered women stay. Right.
But
why did you stay?
Why didn't you leave specifically? Not like statistics of other women, but why didn't you leave specifically?
Okay, specifically, the number one reason being you're afraid of losing your children because when you go to the courts, they don't believe you as an abused man. You use children, so there was fear of losing your children. There's also you're totally isolated. That you cannot even go to a domestic violence advocate who can help you. I also called the shelter to get help. The shelter told me we help only women, not men. So that they did not help either. We went to court, a year earlier. Again, the court did not help her, did not help me, and so you get isolated. So she's telling all these stories, and you feel trapped. The shelter doesn't help you. The domestic violence advocates do not help you because under the gender-based violence dogma, they don't believe that men can be victims. And look at their track record, with 30,000 homicides.
So Mo, you didn't think of leaving yourself and filing for divorce if you were being abused? You didn't. Did you think the only way out was to take her life?
Well, that's unfortunately the mental state of a person who's suffering from the battered spouse syndrome. And as there are thousands of women who have done the same thing, that they could have left. There are shelters available to them. There are advocates available to them. So they also don't end up leaving because the mental state of, this is a very important point that case law explains, that the mental state of an abused person is very different from the mental state of a non-abused person. And a good example that I can give you is think of a dog that is trapped by an electric fence. So every time the dog tries to escape, he gets an electric shock, and after a while, even if you take the electric fence down, the dog will not run away. He feels trapped. So this is what's called learned helplessness. So the person is in that state of learned helplessness that they don't see any way out, just like that dog or just like the battered woman who killed. So abused person, from your vantage point of view, you could probably see a lot of escape routes. But when you're in it, you cannot see them because that's what long-term abuse does to the mental state of the abused person.
Okay, so Mo, somebody else asked after the crime took place, how did you clean yourself up in the crime scene, and did you get in the car dirty? Because I know that your children were in the car at the time. So, yeah, how did you clean yourself up in the crime scene, and did you get in the car dirty?
Okay. Basically, I had come into the office, and then when the homicide happened, I did not know when I was in the office that there were children in the car, and so I did not find that out until after I left the office where I the kids in the car. So I did not know that part, but I did not clean up anything. I got into my van and I went into my car and I went straight to the Orchard Park Police Department. And I told the police officer that what just had happened and to turn myself in. The police did not even know that a homicide had happened. They had no idea. And later on, they said this is the first case that they've ever seen where a person has just come in and self-reported and turned themselves in. And again, later I learned from case law that in 95% of battered spouse syndrome cases, the battered spouse themselves call the police or report the homicide themselves. They don't run away. They turn themselves in because in the mind of a battered spouse, you have acted in self-defense. Now, another important point on this is that one key aspect of an abusive person is they have a split personality, what doctors call Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the outside world sees the Dr. Jekyll personality, but it is only the spouse who sees Mr. Hyde. So by the time the homicide happens, the abuse from Mr. Hyde has been so long that anger and fear has metastasized into rage and terror. So the battered spouse almost always overkills the abuser because in their mind they're killing Mr. Hyde, not Dr. Jekyll. So that's the key reason why battered spouse syndrome homicides are always overkill. And again, it's been documented in many court opinions as to why this kind of thing happens.
Okay. All right. So you basically felt like you had to do it because you were being abused. Even though she had filed for divorce, you felt like what it was going to continue, even though you guys were separated at the time.
Yeah, basically, it had just been 1 week, and there had been hundreds of threats of protection orders, restraining orders, taking the kids away, and all I was trying to do was get her help, get her into treatment, get her into counseling, so she can get help. And there's a very important psychological reasons why abusers avoid getting treatment, and that goes back to an issue called internalized shame, which is one of the psychological injuries. So they feel inside that they're very, very bad, evil people, and counseling means getting in touch with their basically negative side. Internalized shame, which is self-hatred, their self-image is very negative, very poor, very evil. They fear that if they go in counseling or if anybody else finds out who they really are, the whole world will reject them. And that's what borderline personality disorder explains, that people who are borderliners or abusers, they have a profound fear of abandonment. There's a Dr. John Gunderson at Harvard Medical School. He wrote a paper called They Have a Terror of Aloneness. So basically, because of that fear, they don't want to go into counseling because they don't want anybody to find out who they really are.
Okay. So Mo, we don't have much time left. Maybe like the end of this call, and then maybe like another 15 or 20 minutes. But I just want to take any other questions or comments, or if anybody wants to come up here and talk to you, they can.
I was wondering, he went through 3 attorneys before he then represented himself. If he could, would he have chosen an attorney instead?
Okay, very good point. Yes, of course, like in normal circumstances, to represent yourself is quite foolish. But here are the facts, which at the time I did not have facts. I really did not have a choice because there's not a single attorney in America who's ever presented the battered spouse syndrome evidence on behalf of a man. Not one. There are 1.4 million lawyers in America. Now, there's not a single attorney in America that has taken these 2,000 scientific studies and presented to a court of law in what's called a Brandeis brief, in which you show the scientific data to show that the law itself is unconstitutional. Not one attorney has done that. Now, there are 4 or 5 attorneys who've done pieces of it. They get shot down by the courts. But that's not only the case. The U.S. Congress and 51 legislatures have all enacted laws similar to the Violence Against Women Act. Not a single attorney has ever presented an abused man in any legislature or presented any scientist in any legislature or any doctor. So why is this happening? Attorneys are obviously very qualified, intelligent professionals among blacks and whites because they fear that this whole mob is going to destroy their careers. So nobody wants to touch this issue. So it's unfair to blame the lawyers because it goes to all the lawmakers and it goes to the White House. In the White House, they have created an organization called Gender Policy Council. The issue of domestic violence sits inside the Gender Policy Council, which says only men abuse women. And in order to accomplish that, the Gender Policy Council, led by Jennifer Klein, censors all scientific data. There are hundreds of studies done on abused men that document how men are being abused. They're all censored at the White House. The medical doctors from the CDC, National Institute of Health, the U.S. Surgeon General's office, they have tons of research. None of those doctors are allowed to speak. So this is a very, very sad situation where for political reasons, science is being suppressed and the voices of abused men are being suppressed. So going back to your question of attorneys, I would be happy to be represented by an attorney if you can identify to me that if there's a single attorney in America who has ever presented the battered spouse syndrome on behalf of a man, or a single attorney who's ever presented the scientific data to the court. One of my last attorney, Shorts, I asked him to present the scientific data. He told the judge that he believes it's unethical for him to do that. On appeal, there was another attorney. On appeal, I went through another 3 attorneys, by the way. He said to me, you've done excellent scientific research, but my own credibility will be lost if I present this data to the court. I recommend you do this work on your own, in your own pro se brief. Right? So I'm not an attorney. I should not have to do that. This is something the attorneys should be doing. But attorneys are not only afraid, all the judges are afraid. All the lawmakers are afraid. This is exactly the same environment as Jim Crow, where black people could not go to lawyers for help. Black people could not go to shelters run by the Ku Klux Klan, who turn away black people. So by putting women in shelters, those women can escape without having to kill their male abusers. And those shelters don't help them. Is that fair? Where could I have gone? So my quarrel is not with the attorneys. My quarrel is directly at the White House level, at the Department of Justice level, which is presenting false information to the whole nation.
So I'm tapping in here.
My issue is,
Okay, feel free.
my issue is, go ahead.
So People versus Walker from 1983 in California states very specifically, the gist of the defendant/appellant's testimony, as well as that of other defense witnesses, was to the effect that Walker was an emotionally battered husband. That's from 1983. You can carry on.
Do you have the citation to this case law?
145 Cal App 3D 893.
Cal 3D what?
145 Cal App 3D 893.
893. All right. I will look it up, but the point is that is that the case of an intimate partner homicide?
Yes.
And I don't think that case involves the use of battered husband syndrome or battered spouse syndrome, because I've not come across anything in entire Westlaw.
It specifically states that the defense counsel presented that to, it says, was an emotionally battered husband that his mind formulated the thought that his only option to end the repressive situation he found himself in was murder. In his final argument, defense counsel argued the existence of the emotionally battered psychological state of mind of the defendant/appellant, and that Walker did not and could not have deliberated the act of murder at the time that it was committed. Defense counsel asked the jury to return with a verdict of murder in the second degree.
Okay. I will look up this case and find out, and I will respond to Andrew. And probably forward information to you.
Okay, so Mo, when you got into the car right after doing this homicide, did your kids ask you why you had red on your clothes or anything, or did you like clean yourself up before you got in there?
My children did not ask me anything. I did not tell them anything. I had about $5,000 on me, so I gave them to my oldest son, Michael, and I did not tell them anything. I went straight to the police station from there. In my mind at the time, there was a protection order on me, so I was feeling that maybe I cannot talk to them, and so that was my state of mind at the time. So I gave the funds to him, and then I drove to the police station to let them know.
With them in the car?
Yeah, they were in Aasiya's van. I have 4 children, 2 from my first marriage. So Michael was the oldest one, and the 2 younger ones were in the back in the van. So, I saw them, they saw me. It was dark out, so I don't think they noticed the blood on me, or I never cleaned up or anything. And they never asked me anything, I never said anything. I just gave him the funds so that, I was feeling they'll have some difficult times ahead of them. So at least, give him some funds I had, and then, went to the police station.
Right. So somebody asked if this was pre-planned.
In hindsight, I should have stayed there, explain the whole situation to the kids, call 911 from there, and all that. And you mean having $5,000?
No, I mean, was this like premeditated? Like, did you plan this out? Because I know you went to the store, I think 2 or 3 hours beforehand and got some supplies to carry this out. So was this would you say this was premeditated?
Okay, so basically what I said, when the final abuse happened between 2 to 3 p.m. window, and the actual homicide happened close to 6, so there was a 3 to 4 hour window. So in that period, I went to Walmart and bought a couple of knives and came back to the office where I met her, and that's where the homicide happened. So again, in a street violence case, you would look at it as premeditated, but in a battered spouse syndrome case, there's always 3 to 4 hour kind of a gap between the final act of abuse and the actual homicide. And the law explains that the way the mind of an abuse victim processes things is in their own minute aloneness, they come to realize that there's no way out of this situation. So they go into this dark mode that they're trapped and there's no way out. And that's when they act in self-defense, even though there may be a significant gap in hours between the last act of the abuse and the homicide. And this is explained in several case law, and I can email you some of those citations in case law as well.
Okay, so you're saying you went to go get the knives and everything, and then you called her down there, but it wasn't planned out?
Well, no, she was coming back to meet me, like clothes and my property or stuff like that. So again, I think the difficulty here becomes that you're looking at it from the point of view of a traditional self-defense versus a battered spouse syndrome self-defense situation. If you look at it from a traditional, you would think, it has to be all at the same time. But in a battered spouse syndrome self-defense, there's always a gap of several hours between the last act of abuse and the homicide, and that is not considered premeditated in the context of battered spouse syndrome.
Okay, so somebody's asked the same question a few times, I think, now, and basically, why did you choose a knife over another weapon, and why was it so brutal?
Right. Well, I hate guns. I've never owned a gun. I don't like guns. I don't know how to use a gun. And so that's why I kind of didn't want to go that route. And the reason why it was so brutal or overkill is, again, I've said in an article, I will explain to you that the mental state of the abuse victim is that this abuse has been going on for so long and non-stop. So the anger has slowly built up to a state of rage, and the level of fear has risen up to a level of terror. So the mindset of that abuse victim is that of rage and terror. And what the case law explains that only after people hear the full years-long history of the abuse, they can understand the mental state of the abuse victims. I only read you a few excerpts from 10 emails. There are 4,000 pages of emails with 2,000 emails. So you finally fully understand what that abuse victim was going through, gives you a better idea how that fear and anger has been building up. So that is why, for example, there's a Barbara Sheehan in Queens, New York. She killed her husband with 11 bullets from 2 guns while he was in the shower. So at the time he was not abusing her. He had abused her 6 hours earlier, but he was in the shower. So it's considered ambush pattern with the murder charge by presenting the battered spouse syndrome. Similarly, in most there's Anita Gallegos in New Mexico who beheaded her husband while he was sleeping, because what the abuse victim is seeing is Mr. Hyde, not Dr. Jekyll. And the level of terror and fear is so high that by the time the abuse victim acts, they cannot control themselves. And there's a neurological explanation for it as well. It's basically in the inner side of the brain is something called the rage circuit. The rage circuit has hypothalamus, so basically when a person feels afraid or an attack, the rage circuit takes over. But we have pre-cortex, frontal cortex, which acts as a self-restraint kind of a device in the brain. But what happens in the battered spouse syndrome cases is the rage circuit takes over the frontal cortex, which acts usually in a brain. So then there's case law that explains that biologically or neurologically, they lose the functionality of their frontal cortex in that mental state.
So Mo, somebody had
I can send you some case law to that effect as well, if you
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, you can send that. So somebody had asked, was it your goal to make her suffer or for the abuse to end, or was it both?
No, at the time, my goal was to get out of this nightmare, and I couldn't find any other way to get out. And to be honest,
Was she bigger than
I'm
you?
very sorry. I do not condone violence, and basically, this kind of thing is just like it never ends. And she's going around telling completely false information to my children. I would never talk to my children or explain anything to them because I wanted to keep them out of this situation as much as possible. But I would learn that behind my back, she's telling all sorts of fictional stories to my kids and turning them against me. And that's part of the isolation tactic that abusers do. Because, you cannot talk to them and resolve anything because their agenda is to control you. Their agenda is not to solve any problem with you.
Mo, was she bigger than you?
No, women usually are not, which is another big misconception that people have, that just because somebody's physically smaller than you, they cannot be abusive or they cannot threaten you. Again, this is a psychological illness. You have coercive control weapons on you, plus even physically, women who perpetrate abuse not by physical strength, but by using weapons, knives, scissors, baseball bat. So a lot of confusion comes in that people think of a domestic violence situation as a crime where physical size is important and it is relevant. But in domestic violence situation, size is irrelevant because the person's need to control the victim is psychologically driven. Because again, once you understand the concept of soul murder and inner emptiness, it's very similar to an alcoholic. An alcoholic uses alcohol to fill that inner void. Similarly, in domestic violence, the abuser is using the spouse as the bottle. So the spouse becomes the drug, the alcohol. So they're trying to fill their inner emptiness with that spouse, and eventually the spouse rebels.
Who put the kids in the car?
What is very unfortunate is that our judicial system is being trained by these gender-based violence advocates who have no medical or scientific training at all whatsoever. And because of that, they have produced an enormous carnage and destruction of human life, which is detailed in their graph. But all of that evidence, and this is FBI's data on FBI.gov, all of this evidence is being swept under the rug just to promote the fiction that the Violence Against Women Act is saving the lives of women. And the reason I'm trying to talk to all of you is because I want this to change. I don't want what happened to me to happen to other people. I don't want what happened to Aasiya to happen to other women who are getting every day, 3 times a day. So, we need to change this policy to stop this carnage. Because until we recognize men and women as equal victims of domestic violence, as is supported by overwhelming corpus of science, these tragedies will continue to happen. And I also don't believe that, as an abuser, Aasiya should have been punished. Aasiya should have been given treatment, medical treatment mandated by the court. So, because it was not her fault that she suffered childhood abuse. It was not her fault that she suffered abandonment. As children, we don't get to choose our parents. It happens. So they do all this stuff unconsciously, and they don't have any awareness, and they cannot stop themselves. It's, there's a doctor on that who explains this becomes an addiction for them to abuse their spouse. That's the only way they can release their inner tension.
So Mo, since she filed for divorce right now, why not just go through with the divorce? The abuse would be over, and then move on with your life.
Okay, very good question. One, going back to the issue, in my mind then, and I still believe that divorce was being used as a weapon by her, because when you go to court, absolutely nobody believes you. You're not allowed to present your evidence. You're not allowed to show that a woman is the abuser. And so the whole legal system is being used to re-victimize the battered man. And this is not just my personal experience or observation. As you look through thousands of studies on that website, domesticviolenceresearch.org, and there's a Dr. Elizabeth Bates who's written a book on domestic violence against men. They all state that the judicial system is used as a weapon by female abusers because they're able to present themselves as battered women, because the judges have been miseducated to diagnose abusers based solely on gender, not on any psychological testing. And actually, we had psychological testing done, and Aasiya came out at the top of the scale for domination and control. And the same psychological testing showed that I was weak and submissive. Again, when this evidence was trying to be presented to the jury, it was not allowed, suppressed. Same thing happens. You cannot present this evidence in any legislatures. I mean, think of the irrationality to enact a law where you don't even allow abused men to testify in the Congress or in any state legislature, right? And then you expect them that they can go to a court. Look at the record of my own trial judge, Judge Thomas P. Franzak. He served 20 years on the bench. In those 20 years, he never placed a woman in a background program, not once. And all the science says that the majority of the domestic violence abusers are women. So clearly something is very wrong, either with American scientific research or our judicial system that has been hijacked by these gender-based identities. The White House has been hijacked by them. You know, the Department of Justice, for 30 years, they spent $50 billion trying to save lives of women under the Violence Against Women Act. What are the results? Look at the results. Where's the accountability of these $50 billion?
Mo. So somebody wants to know. Do you think what you did is wrong?
Check your messages.
Do you think what you did?
Of course it is wrong. I don't condone violence. I absolutely do not condone violence. It should not have happened.
You've got us muted.
Get out. I should have been given domestic violence advocates to help me. I should have been given shelters to help me. I should have been given a court who could have put my wife in treatment. Instead, the whole system keeps abusing you again and again and again. And when you try to inform that the system is wrong, there's a complete denial. But when you show them the data that this is not my case alone, you're doing this to 3 to 4 women every single day. They sweep that data under the rug. The media does the same. So please tell me, is this sex discrimination against abused men wrong or not wrong? Why are you not helping male victims of domestic violence?
I know plenty of men that have been
wrong
over time, over the years that I've known. And I also know men that have walked out of situations. I myself have walked out of situations. So it's not that, I mean, I know it's hard to walk out of these kinds of situations, but if you have a moment, that opportunity to leave, you do. Just like you had the moment of opportunity to take it into other hands. You did a different thing with that moment. You know, I just feel it's not justified to go about it that way.
No, I understand where you're coming from, that you have an assumption that a person can leave, and some battered spouses do leave, and they're able to get out. But there are thousands of battered spouses, there are thousands of battered women who have killed their abusive husbands, and they have presented the battered spouse syndrome at trial, and they have been acquitted of the murder charge. Right? And is it fair to not allow me to present my overwhelming documented evidence of abuse is it fair to not allow me to bring in my medical doctors who diagnosed me with battered spouse syndrome to present the whole situation from, that perspective? I mean, is it fair?
The bottom line is that women don't get to apply it.
For help?
Hey, women don't get to just randomly apply it. It has to do with the fact that there's a lot of things that go into it. And this is one of those things that I could sit here and argue that women were treated very unfairly for a long time for not having a battered spouse defense. But that aside, in some cases, it's just not appropriate to use. A lot of things that go into this is about a power dynamic. And part of that has to do with my question before about was she smaller than you? I was going to ask, was she stronger than you? The thing of it is you chose something that was very personal, which causes you to have to get up close. And if there's a power dynamic that's happening there, that's not usually the choice that someone would make. That's all.
Again, I think you're approaching this from the perspective of what things happen in street crime level, because in the case of when husbands are being abused, the power dynamics is reversed because the female abuser can use the state to unleash terrorism on the abused victim, so he has no way out.
But he can still physically overpower her in a moment in the same way that you did on that particular day is exactly what I'm saying. So you're just supporting exactly what it is that my contention was.
What'd you do with the head?
Men are physically stronger and bigger, so that's why many times I was able to run away from her. But men are also, use chivalry, so we don't hit back when she's hitting me. And, this allows female abusers to batter their men with impunity because abused men don't hit back because of the power dynamics. So
that's a very definitive blanket. That's a very definitive use of language to say that they never fight back, in the same way it was that this has never been presented to a court. There has never been an attorney who has used this before.
Well, and sometimes battered spouses do fight back, and it's called violent resistance, and sometimes battered spouses do fight back, and it's called battered spouse syndrome. So my question to you is, if women have been acquitted of a murder charge by presenting the battered spouse syndrome, why has the battered spouse syndrome never been applied on behalf of a battered man?
I've already given you a case where that has happened. I literally gave you a case from 1983, which was many, many years before your crime.
Exactly. And then,
I'm not familiar with that case. I will read that case. But, for it to go all the way back to 40 years, and in 40 years, half of all the abuse victims are men and nothing else to come up in this 40-year period. I mean, what does this say? And where does it come from, the point of view that you're enacting a law in which you don't even allow abused men to testify?
That's why it got changed to battered spouse instead of battered wife, because there is an acceptance for it. There is an allowance that has been created for it. But that aside, it still goes back to that whole power dynamic. It goes back to that thing about how men have the ability to overpower the woman in those situations, exactly like what happened on the day that she died.
Okay. Again, I think the difficulty that you are having is that you're looking at it as a street.
Sir, I'm a law professor.
Can you let me finish, please?
But I want you to understand that I'm a law professor, so I'm not looking at it like I'm uneducated on the matter. I literally use LexisNexis to pull up cases to start preparing to send you.
Okay. But let me finish my thought if you don't interrupt. And if you can send me that email, send me the email stuff on regular mail, that would be very helpful. But my point is that you keep going back to the power dynamic. But what you're not understanding is that in battered spouse syndrome cases, there's a psychological power dynamic. And in that psychological power dynamic, the abuser, who's a woman, has significantly more power dynamic over the husband. And that is the reason why these could happen. It has nothing to do with physicalness. And that's where your argument of power dynamics is erroneous, because you're looking at it as a physical thing, where this is a completely psychological issue that we're dealing with. And that even the desire to abuse and control is an innate thing that comes from an inner psychological disturbance. It's not rational behavior. And this is why it's very important to understand domestic violence from its medical perspective of adverse childhood experiences and the psychological injuries, which are known as internalized shame, insecure attachment, and personality disorder. That a lot of times people don't understand or know this, so they fall to the physical size difference, and which takes them down into an erroneous path rather than understanding the psychological power dynamics that are in play, because the abused man is completely isolated, he's completely trapped, he's completely helpless, nobody's helping him, there's no place to go, and that's his mental state, and that's why those things happen.
So the real answer here, what did you do with her head?
Mo.
To my earlier point that there are 1.4 million lawyers in America, how come there's not a single lawyer who has presented an abused man in front of a state legislature? How come? There are thousands of scientists who have published these studies for 40 years. When you look over the legislative history of the Violence Against Women Act, there's not one scientist allowed to present these studies as men or equal victims of domestic violence. And that 2/3 of the scientific studies find that 2/3 of all severe domestic violence perpetrated by women.
Gee, that sounds worse.
What? No. Oh man.
I have a question. So, what caused her, and when did she start abusing you? Was it after she had your kids, or a few years after, or what?
Well, the abuse kind of started right on the honeymoon. That's the first time it happened. We had gone to a resort area, and this was in Pakistan, and there was a particular hotel she wanted to stay at, and the tour people who took us there, they were showing us different hotels, and she got really, really mad and angry because she wanted to stay at that very hotel, and that's when she started hitting me. And later on, we found out that the hotel that she wanted to stay was closed for renovations, so we couldn't go anywhere there. And that's the first time I saw her physical violence, as well as shouting and screaming and name calling, which totally stunned me at that time. So it started pretty much right after the marriage. But before the marriage, I did not see that side. Before the marriage, I saw a side that was, when I go back and look at the emails from our courtship, that were extremely needy and very, very constantly calling me, constantly sending me emails, even though I said, please, we can talk on weekends. During the week, I'm busy. She'll just nonstop, and then she'll tell herself, write email herself that I harass you like a stupid child or whatever because I love you so much. And then later on, when doctors saw those emails, they're like, this is clearly a person who's got a lot of insecure attachments and childhood trauma.
You have 1 minute left.
So she was needy, and wanted to get attached so strongly. But at that time, I did not know all that information or understanding of that. So the abuse started right from the beginning.
Mo, so before it cuts off, what did you do with her head?
Get it out, Andrew. Left next to the body.
I mean, I just walked out. I didn't do anything. I mean, I just left.
Okay, all right. Well, all right, Mo. We'll
Who put the
wrap
kids in
up.
the car? Who put the kids in the car?
Who put the kids in the car?
Andrew, pardon me.
Who put the kids in the car?
When she came in the van, the kids were already in the car. I mean, I didn't. So when I walked out, I saw the van, and the kids were already sitting in the van. The kids had never come in.
He didn't think to ask where his kids were.
Using Securus. Goodbye.
Unforbidden truth.